Hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today we are going to be discussing the 2023 2024 college football season playoffs. I'm not going to go over every single playoff scenario. I'm only going to pick a few that I think are the most interesting or the most fun to talk about and discuss. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into scenario number one. So, to start off here, the 16 teams that I have typed out here, along with the records for the purposes of this discussion, are the 16 teams that I think have, I would say, an above 1% chance of making the college football playoffs. Could be 1% as well, so maybe 1% and above. These are all the teams that I would put into that category. So for this scenario, I have Michigan going 11-1, Ohio State with the asterisk by them, meaning they won their conference, going 13-0, Penn State 10-2, Wisconsin 10-3, losing in the Big Ten championship game, Alabama 12-1, losing in the SEC championship game, Georgia 13-0, winning the SEC championship, LSU 10-2 with losses to Alabama and Florida State out of conference, and Tennessee with their losses to Alabama and Georgia. Then on the right, Washington 10-2, Oregon 10-2, USC at 12-1, winning the Pac-12, Utah at 11-2, losing in the Pac-12 championship game, Florida State 12-1 with a win over LSU, and Clemson 12-1, splitting with Florida State during their two potential matchups. So Florida State beats LSU out of conference, then loses during their week 4, I think, matchup, and then gets revenge in the ACC championship game. So Florida State at 12-1, Clemson at 12-1. Texas at 11-2, and Notre Dame at 9-3 with losses to Clemson, USC, and Ohio State. So right off the bat, there is a team that perhaps some people would say is missing from this discussion, and that's Oklahoma. I don't think Oklahoma is going to be very good. I think best case scenario, you're looking at 10 wins with you winning the bowl game. I think it's very likely Oklahoma is the fourth best team in the Big 12 behind Texas, Kansas State, and Texas Tech. And Kansas State and Texas Tech are irrelevant for the large part to these discussions. I think even at 12-1, I think a Kansas State or Texas Tech team is going to get left out of the playoffs, and I just don't think Oklahoma is going to get there. So obviously in this scenario, this is like nightmare scenario for the playoff committee. One of them, it's not the biggest nightmare scenario, but it's one of them, because obviously you have 4 one-loss or undefeated conference champions, and Alabama at 12-1 with ranked wins likely over both LSU and Tennessee, as well as an out-of-conference win against the Big 12 champion Texas. So this is a very interesting scenario because you have effectively 5 teams competing for 2 spots. So Ohio State and Georgia, they're going to be ranked 1 or 2, likely Georgia 1. They're 13-0, they get in automatically. And then you have USC, Florida State, Clemson, Alabama, and Michigan all sort of competing for potentially those last 2 spots. Now, in this scenario, because of the out-of-conference schedule, Michigan is likely out of the playoff discussion, really. But, there is a chance maybe a lot of the other Big Ten teams that they play do ridiculously well, and they end up having 4 or 5 ranked wins. Maybe that could put them back into the discussion, but I don't think so. So now we're down to 4: Alabama, USC, Florida State, and Clemson. Now, I think we can go ahead and put Florida State in as a lock at one of those 2 positions because of their non-conference win over LSU. And the fact that Alabama also beat LSU, they're kind of parallel to each other. And I think because Florida State won their title game and Alabama lost, I think Florida State would get in as well. I think that would be a safe assumption in this scenario. So for the last spot, it's between Clemson, USC, and Alabama. And you might think, oh, this is a pretty easy decision to make. USC won their conference. Well, in this scenario, their one loss is to UCLA, who, if you notice, is not on this board. So they're probably going to be a middling sort of team, maybe 8-4, and USC should be clearly better to them. That's the worst loss by any of the teams still talking about this. So even though they won the Pac 12, that loss to UCLA, it's a rivalry game, it's cool, but that's the worst loss of the three teams that we're talking about here. You have Alabama, whose only loss is to the number one team in the country. Alabama, the previous week, before the playoffs started, during championship week, was likely ranked number one or number two. And Clemson was likely ranked 3, as they were undefeated heading into that game. So those two things kind of knock each other out, and they're back down on the same level with Alabama and Clemson in my mind. So it then becomes who has the best win. And it's not USC. USC would have beaten Oregon and Utah twice in this scenario, but Alabama has beaten LSU, Tennessee, and Texas out of conference. Clemson has split with Florida State and beaten UNC and Notre Dame. So Notre Dame at 9-3, that's not that great of a win for Clemson and USC, as well as Washington and Oregon. Now, you could also say the same thing about LSU and Tennessee, but we all know that the playoff committee treats SEC teams differently. So LSU and Tennessee are both likely to still be ranked in the top 10, even with 2 losses. So Alabama would have probably at least 2 top 10 wins and a win over the Big 12 champion. And that's why in this scenario, if all this plays out like I am predicting, I believe the Final Four will look like this. Georgia, number 1, Ohio State, number 2, Alabama, number 3, and Florida State, number 4, with USC at 5 and Clemson at 6. Kind of like each of the last 2 years, I think the playoff committee, even though you could make the argument the teams should be ranked differently, like Alabama and Florida State should probably be flipped, they're going to want to avoid rematches when possible. You know, like last year, I thought it was pretty obvious that Ohio State should have been 3 and had the rematch against Michigan, but they weren't going to do that. And the previous year, I thought a 12-1 Cincinnati team should have been ranked ahead of a Georgia team that lost to Alabama and got utterly blown out in that game. I thought Georgia probably should have gone from 1 to 4, and then it should have been Michigan versus Cincinnati and Alabama versus Georgia in the semifinals. Which, by the way, I don't think that would have changed the outcome of the national title. I think Georgia probably still would have won both of those years pretty easily. As a potential playoff, there is some storylines here, but I really don't like it. I'd rather see other teams make it, you know. It's kind of cool to see Florida State in there. I mean, they made it in 2014, so this would technically be their second, but that was almost like a damn decade ago. So they went all the way down to the basement, and now they're back to the ceiling, so that's kind of cool. But if this is the playoff scenario, it would be underwhelming to me. So for this scenario, we're going a little bit wacky. Let's start off over here on the left. I got Michigan going 13-0 in this scenario. Ohio State 10-2 with a loss to Notre Dame and Michigan. Penn State 10-2 with a loss to Michigan and Ohio State. Wisconsin 10-3 again. Alabama 11-2, Georgia 11-1, LSU 11-1, and Tennessee 11-2. So how does this all work? Well, this is how it works. Alabama loses to Texas in their matchup earlier on in the season, and then runs the table. They beat LSU, giving them their 1 loss, and Tennessee, giving them their 1 loss. But in the final week of the regular season, Auburn pulls off an upset in the Iron Bowl. Doesn't change anything. They still make the SEC championship game at 10-2 with the out-of-conference loss. Tennessee loses to Alabama in the regular season, but then pulls off the upset against Georgia, making them have the SEC East title. Then Tennessee loses again to Alabama in the SEC championship game, meaning that there are 4 SEC teams with 11 wins. 2 of them have 2 losses. Now, the Pac-12, same as last time. Washington 10-2, Oregon 10-2, USC 12-1 conference champs, Utah 11-2, losing to USC twice. Where we see another couple of changes is in the ACC, with Florida State 11-2 having now lost to LSU out of conference, and Clemson 11-2, having lost to Notre Dame out of conference. They then split those two games in the regular season and end up 11-2, both of them. Texas beats Alabama, as I said earlier, and ends up 12-1. Notre Dame, with wins over Ohio State and Clemson, end up 11-1, with their only loss being to USC. So Michigan here 13-0 would be in the playoffs, lock number one. USC and Texas are very likely to be 2 or 3. In this case, I'm going to put Texas at 2 because the win over Alabama is very impressive to me. Also, just the timing of their losses. I think I have Texas losing to Oklahoma in the Red River rivalry, which is earlier on in the season. USC gets upset by UCLA, which is later on in the season. So Texas at 2, USC at 3. Then you've got two one-loss SEC teams who did not make their conference championship game. Ironically, both having better cases to make the playoffs than the two teams that made the SEC championship game. Alabama already lost to Texas and got upset by a middling Auburn team. That's not a great resume to get into the playoffs. I think, honestly, the team with the best resume of the all four, really, SEC teams to make the playoffs is LSU. Their only loss is to the SEC champion. So they are probably the contender out of the SEC to me. And then Notre Dame is 11-1 as well. So those are the two teams fighting for this last spot in this scenario. So the argument for LSU would be, we beat the ACC champs, and their only loss is to the eventual SEC champions. However, they would only really have the one big-time win against Florida State. Everybody else that they play, there'll probably be maybe 3 or 4 ranked teams that they would have wins over, but Notre Dame would have wins over a likely top 10 ranked Clemson and a top 15 ranked Ohio State. And the strength of those two wins would, in my opinion, propel Notre Dame into the playoff over LSU. Also, there is another factor, and that is matchups. The fact of the matter is, having these two matchups in the playoffs would be so ridiculous and so awesome. I don't think that the College Football Playoff Committee would put LSU in, because look at these matchups. You would have Michigan versus Notre Dame, a legendary all-time rivalry, and Texas versus USC, and you could market the entire 3-week span from the end of the regular season to New Year's Day or New Year's Eve, whenever they play these games, about that 2005 national championship game in the Rose Bowl. You bring Reggie Bush there, you bring Vince Young there, maybe you give Reggie Bush back his Heisman, who knows? And then in the national championship game, you could either have Michigan and USC, which would be a rematch of what very often in the 80s and 90s was the Rose Bowl game, or Michigan and Texas, which are the two biggest fan bases in all of college football, or Notre Dame versus USC, which is a rivalry game that Notre Dame's only loss would be to USC, so that adds some extra salt to it, or Notre Dame versus Texas, who have never really played each other despite being legendary blue blood programs and also massive fan bases as well. So every single potential national championship matchup would just be awesome to see. This is my favorite scenario out of all of them that we're going to be talking about. It would just be so cool and so electric. You've got Texas and USC, who have never made the playoff before. Michigan, who's made it the past 2 years, but they haven't won a game, so nobody really cares if they make it. And Notre Dame, who, again, they've made it a couple of times, but they never won a game, so nobody really cares. And even beyond that, the stories that would come out of this. Every team would have a legitimate chance to win the national title. This would be a, Michigan 25% chance to win, Texas 25, USC 25, Notre Dame 25. It would be utter chaos. Nobody would know a damn thing. It would be awesome. And the narratives, the storylines surrounding these teams, for Notre Dame, it would be Marcus Freeman coming out and making a statement saying Notre Dame is perfectly fine without Brian Kelly. For USC, it would be, hey, Lincoln Riley is building something here. Let's go win the national title. Let's go get him that ring, which he's never really had the teams to go get. Texas at number 2 would be Steve Sarkisian getting his win against Alabama, winning the Big 12 and solidifying himself as a top 10 football coach in the country. And Texas would be back. Michigan would be, this is Jim Harbaugh's best team, their best chance at a national title. If they can win this, then they have officially surpassed Ohio State. There would be no argument. They would now be universally a better and more accomplished program than Ohio State, at least under Ryan Day. Just everything about these matchups would be so fantastic to me. It's like a wet dream. It's unbelievable. And I know it's not going to happen, but let a kid dream, all right? Come on. let me dream. This is my fucking video. Let me dream. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our third scenario here. Starting this off, we've got Michigan 11-1, Ohio State 10-2, Penn State 13-0, Wisconsin 10-3, Alabama 13-0, Georgia 12-1, LSU 11-1, Tennessee 10-2, Washington 12-1, Oregon 10-2, USC 11-1, Utah 9-3, Florida State 11-2, Clemson 12-1, winning the ACC, Texas winning the Big 12 11-2, and Notre Dame 10-2. This one isn't interesting so much as a question of who's going to get into the playoffs, because that's pretty clearly set. You have a 13-0 Big 10 champ, 13-0 SEC champ, 12-1 Pac-12, 12-1 ACC champ. You could potentially have a conversation about whether or not Georgia would deserve to get in over Washington at 12-1, but Washington has split with USC, beaten Oregon and Utah, as well as played an out-of-conference game versus Michigan State. Georgia doesn't play anybody outside of Tennessee. And for the sake of what I want the scenario to be, we're going to assume Georgia gets absolutely shellacked by Alabama in the SEC championship game, and Washington absolutely destroys USC in the rematch. So it's pretty clear that Washington would make it as the 4th seed over Georgia. So the games in this scenario would be number 1 Alabama versus number 4 Washington, number 2 Penn State versus number 3 Clemson. And this is interesting to me because of the teams that make the playoffs. Penn State has never made the playoff before. Washington made it once in 2015, I think, but they got beat by Alabama. I think that game was 24-0. So that rematch is potentially a storyline to go on. Can Washington solidify themselves as the new king of the Pac-12 with USC leaving? And Penn State versus Clemson would be a very interesting matchup to me. Heading into this year, they had 2 second-year quarterbacks with a lot of question marks surrounding them. Both of them were 5-star recruits. And if this happens, they've both solidified themselves as 2025 top draft pick contenders. And very similar teams in terms of build, focusing on the front 7 on defense. Penn State, I think, probably has a better secondary than Clemson this year, and very good running the football, both of them, and quarterbacks that have perhaps punched up a little bit this season. And then potential national championship games, you could have Alabama versus Clemson part 65, or Alabama versus Penn State, which would be kind of interesting, or Washington versus Clemson, or Washington versus Penn State. All of those would be pretty interesting matchups, in my opinion. Fun to talk about, fun to watch, I think important as well. And it would just be fresh and interesting. I mean, Alabama and Clemson have both had relatively down times recently. Penn State and Washington would be potentially announcing themselves as teams of the future and programs on the rise. This would just be a fun little playoff scenario for me. So scenario number 4 starts off with Michigan at 11-1, Ohio State at 12-1, winning the Big Ten, Penn State at 11-1, and Wisconsin at 11-2. So how does that all work out for the Big Ten? Well, Wisconsin wins every single regular season game except for Ohio State, and then loses to Ohio State again in the Big Ten championship game. Michigan loses to Penn State loses to Ohio State loses to Michigan. Due to tiebreakers in this scenario, Ohio State would advance to the Big Ten championship game, but Michigan at 11-1 would have a win over the Big Ten champion, and their only loss is to a likely top 10 ranked Penn State. Alabama at 10-2, Georgia at 12-1, LSU at 13-0, and Tennessee at 10-2. So that all works out with LSU beating Alabama, Alabama also losing to Auburn in the Iron Bowl. They do beat Texas, though. Tennessee 10-2, the two losses to Alabama and Georgia. Georgia 12-0, their only loss to LSU in the SEC championship game. Go over to the Pac-12. You got Washington at 9-3, Oregon at 11-2 and winning the Pac-12 title. USC at 11-2, losing the Pac-12 title game. Utah at 10-2. And then you have Florida State at 11-2, Clemson at 12-1, losing to Notre Dame, and Texas at 11-2. Losing to Alabama and some random Big 12 team, with Notre Dame at 10-2, rounding out the contenders. So LSU 13-0, they're in, they're ranked number 1. Ohio State 12-1, they're in. Clemson 12-1, they're in. Likely Clemson 2, Ohio State 3. But who's 4? Well, I set this up purposefully for there to only be 2 contenders, with Georgia and Michigan. And neither of these teams have great schedules. Georgia pretty much only plays Tennessee in the regular season. Michigan pretty much only plays Penn State and Ohio State, and they ended up splitting those games. Neither one of them has a very impressive out-of-conference schedule, and neither one of them has multiple big-time wins. It's pretty much just the one win for each of them, and Michigan's win over Ohio State is more impressive than Georgia's win over Tennessee. However, Georgia, in a close loss in the SEC championship game to the number 1 team in the country, is a much better loss than a probably 6th or 7th ranked one-loss Penn State team. I am pretty confident that heading into the championship games, that it would be probably Georgia ranked number 1, LSU ranked number 2, Clemson ranked number 3, and Michigan ranked number 4 because they just beat Ohio State. Now, Ohio State beating a probable top 10 ranked and 11-1 Wisconsin team would jump past Michigan to the 3 spot. Clemson would move up to the 2 spot, and we're battling between Georgia and Michigan for the 4 spot. And neither one of them has a great resume, as I've already said. But the fact of the matter is, a 12-1 Georgia team is not missing the playoffs. It's just not happening. Even if they have to play back-to-back weeks against LSU, it's just not happening. They're not getting left out. So the matchups would be number 1 LSU versus number 4 Georgia, number 2 Clemson versus number 3 Ohio State. Clemson and Ohio State do have a bit of a history. LSU and Georgia just played each other. There are ways to market this scenario, even though I don't like it, and I think it would have been far more interesting to put Michigan at 4, but I can't make that big of a jump. Like, there's just no way that the playoff committee would put Michigan in over Georgia. Either way, LSU's made it before. Clemson's won 2 national championships. Ohio State has made it like 75 times. Georgia's made it each of the past 3 years and several times before that. This one would just be kind of boring, but I do think in this case they probably did manage to get all 4 of the 4 best teams into the playoffs. It's just that I don't think there would be that much of a drop off from like 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8, maybe even. So really quickly here, we're going to do our last scenario, which I believe is the scenario that the NCAA sees in their nightmares. That being Wisconsin at 12-1 wins the Big Ten, Tennessee at 13-0 wins the SEC, Utah at 12-1 wins the Pac-12, and Clemson at 12-1 wins the ACC. So why is this the nightmare scenario? Well, Three of these teams are very small markets with Clemson, Wisconsin, and Utah. And Tennessee, while it's a big market that has a lot of fans, nobody's really going to be hyped to see Tennessee win anything. Sorry if you're a Tennessee fan, but it's not like a return to form like it would be with Florida State or UCLA or anything, because you were never really outside of like a 4 year stretch in the late 90s, you were never really a consistent powerhouse. Clemson getting back into it, nobody would care. They've won their national titles. Utah and Wisconsin making it would be pretty cool. Luke Fickell's been there before. Utah's been close a couple times. But again, we're not talking about big brands with a lot of fans here. So with all four of these teams, there aren't really any narratives that would be big narratives that they could sell and market about. And there also isn't big enough fan bases for them to just be like, oh, the ratings are going to be great anyway. So as cool, to be entirely honest with you, as cool as this would be to have three teams that have never made the playoff before make the playoff in 1 year, I think the NCAA would be very upset if that happens, because there's nothing to market. The fan bases aren't very large, exception of Tennessee, and there's no real narrative at the front of any of this. There could be an in-season narrative, like maybe Joe Milton has like a Cam Newton-esque season and wins the Heisman Trophy, so that could be an in-season narrative. But that would be about it, if I'm being honest with you. I don't really know what the storylines would be heading into these games. I don't know how they would end up marketing them. They would probably just have to hope that people are going to tune in and watch just because it's college football and it's the playoff. And one of the big off-season narratives would probably be, there's a good chance we're going to see Wisconsin play Utah again in a 12-team playoff. If Wisconsin's the third best team in the Big Ten and Utah is the second or third best team in the Pac-12, there's a good chance they could both make it. So we might see this matchup again, and is that what anybody really wants? I don't know. I think it'd be cool because the styles of play are very similar, and they're two teams who have never really gotten to compete for a national title before, so it'd be pretty cool. But, well, to me, it'd be pretty cool, but it would probably be underwhelming for a lot of people, and I doubt that they could get the casual fan to tune in and watch Wisconsin versus Utah. And that is all that I have for you today. Up next, we're going to go ahead and talk about in depth, probably about 15 to 20 Heisman contenders for this upcoming season. So go ahead and like if you liked this video, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagreed with me at any point, or if you just have something to say, go ahead and leave a comment in the comment section below. But let's keep it civil. After all, what do I know? I'm just some asshole, and I'll see you next time.